Hello, everybody. Good morning to you if you are west of Boston, and good afternoon to everyone here in Boston and to the east of us. My name is Doris Sommer. I am proud to be here with Cuban Studies program at Harvard University and the Department of Romance Languages, and also African and African American Studies. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be talking today with María Isabel Alfonso about Ediciones El Puente and the gaps of the Cuban literary canon, post-revolutionary cultural dynamics. This is a spectacular book that María Isabel offers us as a recovery of perhaps the most important cultural literary phenomenon of Cuba and maybe of the continent in the 20th century. I am also the director of the Cultural Initiative at Harvard, which gives you an idea of why I'm so excited to welcome María Isabel, because culture is a mover of politics, of society. It allows for sociability and allows for innovation. So I want to say something about the project before I introduce María Isabel. The project, as you'll hear from her, is about a recovery, as I say, of an important publication activity called El Puente, and it's the site of important debates about what culture is. And El Puente was an Afrocentric, in many ways, an Afrocentric phenomenon that allowed for real improvisation, real innovation in literary arts. And it found from the beginning a lot of resistance from what was called a revolutionary aesthetic. I want to save the word aesthetic from the kind of encapsulated and controlled idea of a revolutionary aesthetic. Revolution and aesthetic should be synonymous, because aesthetics is about thinking in disinterested and innovative ways. If you know Nicholas Luhmann's work on systems theory, art is always the irritant. It's always the revolutionary. It's always the naughty element that keeps systems working. So to find that there is a tension between this kind of innovative energy and what passed for revolutionary security is really to put your finger on all of the debates about culture. And I'll just say as one footnote that Raymond Williams put his finger on that difference when he noticed that culture means two opposite things. One is an inherited sense of shared practices and beliefs. And that is probably the notion that the Cuban revolutionary government was working with. We share beliefs, we share values. But the other meaning for culture that Raymond Williams underlines is the meaning that artists use, and that is the irreverent, the surprising, the disinterested, the experimental. And those two meanings are, as Williams says, incommensurable. So to give up the tension between those two is to lose a lot of the steam that the Cuban Revolution started to generate and then close down. So I can't tell you how excited I am to invite María Isabel Alfonso to talk to us about this tension and also tell us more about the book. María Isabel Alfonso is professor of Spanish and the chair of the Department of Modern Languages at St. Joseph's College, and she'll be followed by a brilliant commentarist, a colleague that I'm happy to reconnect with, César Salgado, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and Graduate Advisor in the Program of Comparative Literature at the University of Texas in Austin. And before I hand the mic over to María Isabel, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we'll be recording today, and it's a webinar. So the webinar will be available at the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after the session today. We'll also email a link to the recording to everyone who has registered. Second, we hope to see you at other lectures and series that we host here in Dr. Class. In the chat, we've added links on our online calendar as well as social media channels. I'll encourage you to follow us there and to follow the updated information for upcoming events. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. The chat function will be disabled, but if you have a question to our speaker, and we hope you do, feel free to send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session, but feel free to submit it at any time. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming María Isabel Alonso to tell us about her brilliant and much anticipated book.
Thank you so much, Doris, for that lovely introduction. I have to say that your work on 19th century literature made me love 19th century literature, which I didn't love a lot before, so I'm very grateful for that. Before jumping into the talk, I would like to thank Dr. Klaas and Alari for making this happen. Thank you, everyone who organized this panel. Thank you, Jimena, for your coordination behind the scenes, for all the attention to the details. Special thanks to Professor Sommer and Professor Salgado for being here, for agreeing to be part of this panel. Also Alejandro de la Fuente, who can't be here today, but he was also part of the organization. And a special thanks also to Edgar Garcia Valencia and Jesus Guerrero, the editorial team from Universidad Veracruzana, for all the work that they put into the publication of this book. I'm going to share my screen to share with you some pictures from the archive that I have put together from El Puente, and I won't be able to explain all the the graphics and the documents that I'm sharing because of time restrictions, but at the end we can perhaps go back and see some of those photos if you have any questions. In the early 2000s, when I met poet Reynaldo García Ramos at a poetry reading in Miami, and he told me that he had been part of Ediciones El Puente. I remember that sometime in the past in Cuba, I had read that name El Puente in an anthology of Cuban literature. It was only a brief reference, a footnote perhaps, and yet for some reason the name stayed with me. After the chat with Garcia Ramos and numerous trips to the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami, it became clear that I had found the perfect topic for a dissertation, which I wrote during the following years and defended in 2007. Years later, after conducting interviews and additional research, the dissertation took the form of a book manuscript, which the University of Veracruz published in 2016 and then republished this year under its digital catalog. The book is premised on the belief that every canon is susceptible of being deconstructed and reconstructed. And we're going to talk more about the canonicity at the end, but I'm just presenting the idea here. In this sense, it is an attempt to bring El Puente back into the history of Cuban literature. I claim that erasure and distortion have been the tools to exclude Ediciones El Puente from the Cuban literary canon. I also argue that gender, race, power struggles, generational clashes, El Puente's prevailing existentialist aesthetic, as well as the autonomy of the publishing house, were all factors relevant to its demise. Cultural field in revolution, the new power struggle. The triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 signaled not only a radical readjustment in the structures of political power on the island, For the first time, the question of art as a fundamental element in the life of individuals was pondered on a large scale through public debate. Such a collective awareness gave prominence and agency to artists and intellectuals. It also led to tension between the various groups within the newly created cultural establishment. The definition of the roles of revolutionary art, revolutionary aesthetic, as Doris mentioned, and revolutionary artist were central to those debates. For the sake of time, I will only refer to a moment that perhaps epitomizes the tension of those years. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a comment from one of the participants of the discussions at the National Library, Discusiones en la Biblioteca Nacional, in the aftermath of the censoring of a 13-minute film, PM, and in prelude to the shutdown of literary journal Lunes de Revolución. The documentary, PM, was supposed to show how the Cuban people participated in military preparations in the context of Bay of Pigs invasion. Instead, it included images of people dancing and drinking in bars. Alfredo Guevara, then president of the ICAIC, negatively reacted to the film, claiming that it gave a distorted version of what Cuba was. His words would signal the radical literary and political changes that were to come. At the meeting to discuss the film, the discussions at the National Library, in which Fidel Castro pronounced his famous words to the intellectuals, critics took advantage of the opportunity to criticize also Lunes as the magazine to which the directors of the film were associated. And this is what Guevara, Alfredo Guevara, the director of the Cinema Institute, ICAIC, said. I accuse Lunes de Revolución of trying to divide the revolution from within, of efforts to spread ideological confusion, of introducing Polish and Yugoslav theses, exalting Czech and Polish cinema, of being spokespersons for existentialism, surrealism, American literature, bourgeois decadence, elitism, of ignoring the achievements of the revolution, of failing to praise the militias. End of quote. A long list of narrow-minded claims followed, reflecting the intolerance displayed by the cultural establishment, which would soon radicalize. The same year, Theory of Superstructure, Literature and Art by Edith Garcia Buchaca was published, and I'm going to read an excerpt from there just to give you a sense of the atmosphere. In capitalism, this is what Buchaca says, art becomes an art of the minority, occupied by describing reactions and psychological abnormalities of morphine addicts, homosexuals, prostitutes, and the mentally ill. Once again, sensualism, a return to mysticism, clericalism, and superstition prevailed. End of quote. El Puente, the silence. In 1962, in the middle of these dynamics, Ediciones El Puente came to existence, and it lasted only until 1965. They published a total of 37 literary works, 25 books of poetry, 8 volumes of short stories, and 4 play scripts. With access to a private press, it operated autonomously at first, but was no longer an independent entity in 1964, last year, before the closing, when all presses were nationalized. And its directors, Jose Mario Rodriguez and Ana María Simo, this is Jose Mario and Ana María, were offered to work with the UNIAC, with the Cuban Artists Union. Some critics have argued that El Puente was not a literary group, as it did not have a manifesto or a defined editorial line. However, the prologue to the Novísima Poesía Cubana can be read as a manifest of sorts. In it, the Puentistas expressed that they wanted to keep away from two extremes, an intimist poetry that renounced to all contamination with reality, and away also from a propagandistic poetry of occasion that would engage in sloganeering and praising the revolution. The authors added that they wanted to distance themselves from the ivory tower of the group Orígenes, but doing so from a non-sloganeering and anti-propagandistic perspective. Although El Puente was not established as a literary group, through their participation in activities and gatherings that went beyond their publishing duties, they indeed became one, I claim. For example, Josefina Suarez, whom I'm very grateful because she's the one who provided most of these photographs and documents, explained to me in my interviews how they would gather to drink tea or to go to the beach. Here is an invitation, it's very playful, and by Nancy Morejon and Ana María Simo, inviting Lina de Feria to eat cookies and drink tea. And I'm going to show you some of these photographs at the beach that Josefina Suarez shared with me so that you have a sense of who these people were, how young they were. This is a beautiful picture of Nancy Morejon, Lina de Feria on the right, Lina de Feria here with Josefina, who was kind of like the memory of El Puente historian. Josefina Suarez, Ana María Simo and Reynaldo, and Josefina on the right. Reynaldo and Ana María, Nancy and Ana Justina. So you can see that it was a group of Afro-Cubans, very young people who would get together to read poetry, to drink tea. So I claim that even though they didn't have a typical manifesto, they had a sense of being part of something. And besides, they had an editorial, a publishing house. And I hope Reynaldo Garcia Ramos doesn't get mad at me for showing this picture, but this is him being carried by Ana Justina, pretending to be a baby. And this is interesting too, because it is a telegram by Ella O'Farrill excusing herself for not being able to attend El Gato Tuerto's Descarga of Poetry and Feeling, which was I don't have a sense of who is in the public, in the audience, so I'm going to explain really quick in case that someone doesn't know, but it's a musical genre that developed in Cuba after the revolution, in which the troubadour or the singer accompanies himself with the guitar, and it's very much influenced by American music, by jazz, improvisation. So El Gato Tuerto was a famous nightclub in Cuba where they would meet to participate in these filling concerts and also to read poetry. So they were organizing this kind of descargas in which they would get together and share. So in any case, the affinity among its members, the members of El Puente, led for the first time to the unprecedented convergence under the same editorial roof of women, homosexuals, and Afro-Cuban descendants, the majority from poor backgrounds who, far from establishing praise for the revolution as an aesthetic mandate, declared themselves unwilling, and I quote, unwilling to engage in mere occasional sloganeering. Ana María Simón Reynaldo Felipe's director, Ana María, director of the publishing house. Such a narrative had a binding effect. Further, the output of the publishing house was appreciably coherent despite disagreements among the directors. El Puente's cycle of existence was marked by a total silence. Most of the critiques that were put forward after the demise of the publishing house reference a supposed lack of political commitment, as well as resorting to an intimate aesthetics that bypassed the revolutionary agenda. Ediciones interrupted functions in the middle of 1965 when, and I quote Jose Mario, when practically speaking, UNIAC, the Union of Writers, ceased to assume responsibility for it, end of quote. El Puente was not officially closed, but without funding for the paper essential to its print runs, the die was cast. El Puente disappeared that year. Add to that the impact of El Puente's encounter with Allen Ginsberg, to which I will refer in the following sections. 1 year after the end of the Ediciones, and here I'm going to refer to his itinerary of silences, attacks, distortions that surrounded the existence, the aftermath of El Puente. 1 year after the end of the Ediciones, the attacks began. El Caimán Barbudo emerged in 1966 as the publication of politically committed writers. By refusing the Puentistas any visibility in their page, they would become known as writers of the revolution. And I'm sorry, I forgot to pass this on the right timing, but this is a picture that shows also the composition of the group. Here is also Jose Mario, Gerardo Fulleda, Ana María Simo, and Ana Justina, I think in Calle Obispo. So El Caimán Barbudo would claim the writers, the director, to be the writers of the revolution, engaging in aesthetic tendencies like anti-poetry and conversational poetry, which would be emblazoned with the rubric of revolutionary poetry or poesía de la revolución. One of the most vitriolic criticisms came from Jesús Díaz, director of El Caimán Barbudo. When he was asked in a survey, how would you define your generation? He answers, and I quote, "It was not well structured and it was empollada, hatched by El Puente, the most dissolute and negative fraction of the current generation." He goes on to say that they were politically and aesthetically an erroneous phenomenon. And from now, I'm going to make the clarification that when he uses the word empollada, he was indirectly making reference to the homosexual condition of many of the members of El Puente, because in Cuba, I don't know now because I left a while ago, but being pájaro is being homosexual in a pejorative way. So, right. So the use of the word is in a negative sense. It has a homophobic undertones. La Gaceta attack was followed by El Caimán Barbudo's manifesto, Nos Pronunciamos. In the document, the Caimanes rejected the bad poetry that tries to find shelter in poetic words, and I quote, that impregnates itself with the secondhand metaphysics that situates men outside his circumstances. Rechazamos la mala poesía que trata de justificarse con denotaciones, etc. We can go to the slide later if you want. In contrast, the Caimanes referred themselves as the truly committed writers and the keepers of the revolutionary aesthetics. Although there was no explicit reference to El Puente, Díaz acknowledged later that Ediciones was the target. 10 years later, Guillermo Rodríguez Rivera, another signature of the manifesto, make reference to El Puente as a metaphysical, El Puente's metaphysical detachment from reality. And there are other cases in which the critics underline the fact that El Puente was not the first generation of poets of the revolution. I won't go through all of those because of time. Debunking myths and distortions. The attacks against El Puente center on the alleged absence of political commitment and introspective aesthetics that, according to its detractors, distance them from the revolutionary ethos from the time. Following Theodore Adorno's broad perspective on commitment, I argue in my book that El Puente's aesthetic preferences did not imply an anti-revolutionary stance that validated the exclusion from the canon. El Puente's alleged existentialism and experimentalism was in fact in sync with the new times. As Doris mentioned, revolution, aesthetics is revolution. As for the Puentistas, even the revolution was to be analyzed and scrutinized as a continuum with their aesthetic experience through an ontological lens, which was also an experimental one. And there are a few sections here here that I include with poems that reflect that existentialism. But not only were the claims about El Puente's lack of commitment opportunistic and reductionistic in nature, in most cases they were simply false. Explicit commitment was present in many of the texts published by Ediciones, as a poem by Joaquin Santana in which he praises the revolution. He says, and I quote, "When you arrive, revolution singing at my door, only closed for hatred, wide open and like you, glorious, joyful, open for new arms, you bring me the time of freedom." This is to this gigantic scream in Santiago de Cuba, as the crib of the revolution, right? But El Puente not only published explicitly committed texts, they participated in tasks that imply an active level of engagement. Simo refers to this in his answer to Díaz's accusation in La Gaceta. This is the respuesta de Ana María Simo, where she explains how she and García Ramos participated in the creation of the statues of Brigada Hermanos Saiz. I apologize, this is the copy that I could secure. As you can see, it has probably a cigarette burn. But this is the estatutos, or the statues of Brigada Hermanos Saiz, which was a brigade that promoted culture for the masses. And I'm reading an excerpt from Simo, when referring to the estatutos. The central interest was that young creators participated and did not settle for being socially passive elements. Thus, we proposed that they spend part of the year working in factories and farms. An old admiration for Lorca's traveling theater and the principle of art for the masses prompted the planning of a literary workshop for the brigades. Literature, in short, would take the streets, but without giving up positions. So not only the claim that they were not politically committed in their writings was reductionist in nature, it was also false. And it was also false in the text, but also in reality, because they had the willingness to participate in the process. And I'm going to the last section of my presentation. Hopefully I have time to finish, because I know that Professor Sommer has to leave earlier. She's teaching a class today. Biopolitics of erasure and distortion, homophobic attacks, and the issue of race. The hatched generation. Silencing, attacks, and erasures were not only motivated by aesthetic claims and generational jealousy. In many cases, they also responded to overt homophobic sentiments and policies, and to the reluctance to or impossibility of overcoming a racist mentality inherited from the previous era. As Simo states in my interview, race, sexual identity, gender, social class, and independence are the 5 inseparable factors that led to the persecution and ultimately the destruction of El Puente. Blacks, gays, women, and modest people joined in an egalitarian and independent project. We spoke without complexes, as if we had the right to do so. And this is important because apparently they didn't have the right. That was El Puente's transgression. Homophobia was the weapon to silence us, end of quote. The pejorative references to homosexuals, usually a mixture of shoteo and mockery, became politicized and instrumentalized. Social instrumentalization, which contributed to a witch hunt environment, was supported by the creation of the UMAP in 1965, forced labor camps to which homosexuals, called enfermitos or little sicos, and others were sent. The government also implemented the so-called treatments in psychiatric wards, to which Ana Maria Simo was sent, and expelled gays and others perceived as deviants from work and university centers. In this narrative, homosexuality was identified with counter-revolution. It was not explicit theme in El Puente, but they made a big mistake. They met with Allen Ginsberg during his visit to Havana. We're going to refer to that briefly, and I want to show you a picture of a graphic novel that I just got. Thanks, César, for recommending this. But it explains exactly what happened with details. It's very accurate. It's a graphic novel by Anna Belfort, and the meeting meant the end of El Puente, because Jose Mario was accused of meeting with foreigners, and he was detained several times, and after that he was sent to the UMAP. After that, well, if we remember that in the generational survey, Jesus Diaz had made reference to this dissolute and hatched generation. And as Ana Maria mentioned in the interview, and I quote, everyone who read it knew perfectly well what he meant by hatched. There was a climate of terror. At that time, accusing someone of being homosexual was like singing their death sentence in life. And these are 2 examples here that play with the idea of being gays as hatched, the references to someone flying. Matamos 2 páginas de un tiro, instead of 2 pájaros de un tiro, matamos 2 páginas de un tiro. And here is the story of Florito, who was publishing in La Fuente, if you can see here, Ediciones La Fuente. So it's an indirect reference to El Puente. He's divided between the free world and the communist world. So at the end, he runs to John to be saved from the communists. And the last section, well, it's part of this last section is about the distortions from the topic of the perspective of race. And I center this, I'm not trying to summarize, but I center the ideas here on the notion that even from the present El Puente has been distorted. It's like it's karma. Scholars, the few scholars that have been approaching the topic have claimed, some of them, that race played a crucial role in determination. And I argue that it is not necessarily the case, that it was the intersectionality and combination of all these factors that we have been mentioning what led to the demise of El Puente. Specifically, Carlos Moore mentions in Castro, the Blacks and Africa, he mentions the Black Manifesto, devised in 1968 by some Afro-Cubans who refused participation at Havana's Cultural Congress. According to Pedro Pérez Arduy, one of the Puentistas who is a signature of the document and who provided me with a copy, it was not a manifesto, it was a paper that they were going to present at the Congress. It dealt with the topic of racism before and after the revolution and included citations of Fidel Castro and Karl Marx. The document concluded that they will all join in a common destiny laid by the revolution. According to Pérez Arduy, although the document echoed a preoccupation about the persistence of racism, the overall intention was not to demarcate differences with the revolutionary process, but to advocate for Afro-Cuban participation, including full legitimation of Africa's religiosity and cultural legacy. And this is important because even in the anti-racist agenda of the first 2 years, it could be perceived a negative perception of anything that had to do with Africa. Such an acknowledgement did not imply that they wanted out of the revolutionary process. Nevertheless, Linda Howe in Cuban Writers and Artists After the Revolution posits that a group of Black intellectuals in the 60s, and I quote, found themselves as the representative of Black power and an emerging new Black aesthetic in Cuba. Following Moore's false lead, she refers to the alleged Black Manifesto as a sign of separation and dissidence among the Black Cuban intellectuals in the 60s. I argue that Afro-Cubans had more reasons than not to make common cause with the revolution, given the emancipatory nature of its racial agenda, at least until 1969, as Alejandro de la Fuente has claimed. This was the years that were more intention to eradicate racism, and then it faded out after that. And given the emancipatory nature of the agenda, of the racial agenda, and despite the Africanization and apparent racism of some of its leaders, and I'm using here the term as used by Cuban historian Mario Castillo Santana, when he refers to the Africanization in the context of Walterio Carbonell, the way that he uses in his work. At least 50% of the writers at Ediciones were Black, the majority from marginalized sectors. The fact they were published en masse was a novel occurrence that must have fostered a high degree of reaffirmation. It is doubtful, therefore, that they wanted to separate from the agenda, revolutionary agenda, and that race issues per se led to the termination of Ediciones. Because ultimately they were vindicated for the first time, and we'll talk about that later, but many of these writers were not only Black, gays, they were also coming from very low social classes. Georgina Herrera was a maid, or she was cleaning houses, and many of them came from poor neighborhoods. And I'm gonna end with this paragraph here. Intersectionality allows us to get a better understanding of how patterns of exclusion in the context of El Puente worked. By comparing the interrelation of race and gender, we are able to ascertain which element had more weight in the determination of Ediciones. Furthermore, we are able to perceive a consistent pattern. It was not El Puente's Afro-Cubans and queers who did not want to be part of the revolutionary process. On the contrary, although loyal to a distinctive notion of commitment, El Puente writers were trying to fit in. It was the cultural establishment that canceled any possibility for them to do so, let alone to be part of the Cuban literary canon of the revolution. Being gay and celebratory of the Afro-Cuban culture and their political capital did not fit into Che Guevara's model of new men, which we didn't refer. It was actually the new man, that new man, who canceled out, either through attacks, erasures, or distortions, any space for the aesthetically divergent other, be it queer, Afro-Cuban, or heterosexual. The time is long overdue for bringing El Puente back to the history of Cuban literature. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for going over the time.
Thanks to you, Maria Isabel. We could hear you for much longer. And I hope we will. I know that many of us who haven't read you yet will get your book very soon and be able to talk to you in more detail. But the time is ready to recover an important history, not only for aesthetics, but for the politics of liberation. And I'm so happy to have César Salgado here to continue to develop questions for you, not only comments. Okay, so thank you so much for your work and for these beautiful pictures too that you shared with us. Thank you, César, for continuing. Go ahead.
Doris.
Well, thank you, Doris. I appreciate the invitation. I'm really thankful to Maria Isabel Alfonso for thinking of me to give a response to her terrific work. So I have something to read, and I'm going to raise 5 points, of which I might develop 4, and then open the floor to questions. So let me just start. It is my pleasure to comment on Maria Isabel Alfonso's 2 decades worth of devoted research and writing to reconstruct the lost history of Ediciones El Puente, a unique and uniquely suppressed literary enterprise of the early years of the Cuban Revolution, led by José Mario Rodríguez and Ana María Simo from 1962 to 1965, and financed mostly by José Mario's modest fellowship stipend as a student in the University of Havana. El Puente developed as a bare bones independent editorial project that produced and distributed the first books of a group of 23 very young authors, poets, narrators, and dramatists, mostly Black, women, and gay, some just in their late teens, none older than 26 years old when their first publications appeared. During its first 4 years, Puente editions averaged between 500 and 1,000 copies per run, without counting with any official recognition or budgetary support from the new revolutionary state. This happened right at a time when an all-encompassing institutional infrastructure for the promotion of revolutionary writers and artists was being built, when entities such as the ICAIC Film Institute, the Casa de las Americas Arts and Letters Cultural Center, and the UNEAC Union of Writers and Artists, periodicals such as Lunes de Revolución, Revista Casa, and Revista Unión, and state editorial houses such as the Editorial Nacional, Letras Cubanas, and Ediciones R, were igniting the mytho-political imagination of millions of readers, viewers, and followers in Cuba, Latin America, Europe, and the Third World. In her work, Dr. Alonso argues that the singularity of El Puente as a cultural enterprise was not just due to its stubborn autonomy from state control, its resourceful partnership with one surviving private printer, Imprenta Arquimbao, or the peripherality of a circle of authors, all underprivileged from marginal sectors in the neediest barrios in Havana, an unassuming rainbow coalition amid the ubiquitous olive green of Cuban male socialist triumphalism. Its singularity, Dr. Alonso shows us, is also connected with the extremeness of its close to absolute erasure by state officials. State intellectuals either ignored the literary merits of El Puente's struggling young authors or loudly belittled them as corrupt and decadent. They confiscated their last set of manuscripts for publications and expunged their works and names from libraries, official literary histories, and reference works. State police targeted El Puente authors for public harassment, scapegoating, criminalization, and detention, to the extent of forcing its 2 directors into abusive sexual conversion therapy with electroshock treatment for Simo in 1964 and forced labor under confinement for José Mario in 1965. Thus, the canonical gap or vacío that Alfonso documents in her work is also a case of deliberate cultural trauma, an open social, aesthetic, and ethical wound that Puente scholars such as Alfonso, Jesús Barquet, Sylvia César Miskulin, and María Pallenberg are trying to heal and redeem through restorative scholarship. In the remarks that follow, I will address 5 key themes in Professor Alfonso's extraordinary labor of literary recuperation. First, the question of canonicity in early revolutionary Cuba and of El Puente's place therein. Second, the research strategies required to confront the extremeness of El Puente's suppression from any possible canon and overcome both the traumatic dispersal of its materials and of the psychic archive at a moment when the revolution's utopian promise was still strong. Number 3, the foundations for the poetics of revolutionary existentialism that, according to Alfonso, united the diverse discursive, ideological, and aesthetic concerns of all of El Puente writers and intellectuals. Number 4, the role of systemic and institutional homophobia as a state weapon to silence dissenting visions of revolutionary aesthetics and to deactivate intersectional solidarity. And finally, number 5, El Puente as a Cuban manifestation of a prophetic Black, queer, and feminist intersectionality that may have seemed too threatening for a white male, ultra-heteronormative and dogmatic revolutionary establishment. So those are the 5 points. That's number 1. So let me develop the first 4. El Puente's reluctant canonicity. Professor Alfonso makes the case that the innovative quality, consistent aesthetic integrity, and existentially committed character of El Puente production was, despite the youthfulness of its authors, fairly close, if not equal, to the level of that of previous and subsequent groups and generations, Avance, Orígenes, Nuestro Tiempo, Ciclón, Lunes, and the Caimanes, no? The Puente's immediate rivals, the officialist writers of the journal El Caimán Barbudo. It does deserve just canonical restitution in Cuba's literary histories and manuals because of that aesthetic integrity. I ask myself, though, to what extent El Puente's undeserved susceptibility to such cruel exclusion may have been due to its writers' somewhat skeptical vision of canonicity itself, their wise rejection of any type of doctrinal hypothesis, be that of literature or of the revolution proclaimed with a capital L or a capital R. As Alfonso documents in their ambivalent manifestos and in their contemplative poetry, the Puenteros did not proclaim themselves establishing a new aesthetic norm that would outdo those of previous generations. Theirs is a tentative, unsure poetics full of brooding and self-interrogation. Think, for example, of the disarming title of Nancy Morejon's first book, Mutismos, no? And the penchant of some Puenteros to sign only with their first names or even their initials, no? Thus evading the pretension of the great apellidos of the Cuban canon, Heredia, Martí, Casal, Florit, Lezama, Carpentier. I would say that instead of boxing for the championship belt of literary glory, as did so many of their canon fixated predecessors and contemporaries, the Puenteros were, wisely for their age, eran muy sabios para su edad, eso sí, operated laterally, seeing themselves as producing a minor self-sequestered literature in the Deleuzian sense that somehow queered the frame of a major hegemonic one, that of the great canon cubano, constantly disputed and reconfigured by Bloomian agonistic maledom. Number 2, overcoming traumatic dispersal. El Puente's self-assumed queer minoreness may have been thus not a weakness, but the source of its perdurability and of its racial, gender, and sexual diversity, in spite of its scant financial institutional resources and atypical editorial judgment. It also made it an ideal target for monolithic erasure, a guinea pig for new experimental templates of social and cultural control. an intersectional cultural enterprise that have proven itself self-sustainable, independent, and future-oriented, is thus surgically amputated, as Alfonso documents. The literary historian thus faces the violent and close to irreparable dispersal of a material archive that is just as traumatized as the psychic archive of its originators. Books are retired from production or removed from stores and libraries, while authors and editors have little or no way of suing or of expressing their protest or outrage. The only way the material collection can be restored or even approximated is by interviewing the victims, overcoming their reluctance, and recording their testimonies. Find out if they kept copies or manuscript of editions that were disappeared. To get to the material archive, the researcher has first to painfully probe the wound of the cyclical archive, thus adding new tension, human drama, and irresolution to the task of scholarship. Number 3, El Puente's revolutionary existentialism. Before reconstructing the history of the editorial enterprise, the scholar has to first figure out the process of its annihilation. You have to start with the end rather than the beginning. Thus interviewing not just the survivors, but also its executors, verdugos y víctimas, ¿no? Hay que ser interrogado. Alfonso thus documents the strategies used by rival and official entities, the intelectuales Ariel Caimán, especially Jesús Díaz, to discredit, belittle, and falsify El Puente's production as counter-revolutionary, evasionist, decadent, dissolute, corrupt, antisocial, and most of all, as existentialist metaphysical babble. And that was the biggest sort of accusation by the Caimanes. Alfonso counters the hypocrisy of this accusation by exploring and certifying the group's poetic of revolutionary existentialism as the ethos behind most of its production, and as a sign of the group's commitment to and participation in a revolutionary project that guaranteed full expressive freedom. Indeed, Sartrean existentialism had been since the Second World War the norm for literature and for literary revolutionary commitment, literatura de compromiso. And his visit to Cuba with Simone de Beauvoir in February of 1960 surely set terms, themes, and tones that the Puenteros would reflect or refract in their writing and existential worldview. How much was their poetics of revolutionary existentialism shaped by Sartre's idea, and how much by the ideas of Albert Camus? This debate would shape the vision and conviction of some of the boom writers that became revolutionary fellow travelers during the very years of El Puente, such as Mario Vargas Llosa. That's another question, in terms of the foundations of their existential worldview. Number 4, homophobia as state weapon. Alfonso also documents brilliantly how El Puente members were targeted by an instrumentalized version of state-led homophobia, one that culminated with the UMAPs, the labor camps, forced labor camps, to which disaffected and persecuted homosexuals such as Jose Mario were confined for ideological and sexual conversion, along with other misfits. Still, as Alfonso points out, homosexuality was not an explicit theme in El Puente's publications. Homoerotic passages and scenarios appear here and there in a fleeting coded fashion, but remaining well within the closet, not out of it. Still, an indiscreet, allegedly extravagant queerness was often displayed by several of its members with an unrepentant, unapologetic openness, especially by its director, Jose Mario. This display was evident in the group's social occasions, especially during nocturnal soirees and recitals in nightclubs and concert halls, such as the Gato Tuerto, featuring performances by the great singer of the feeling movements, the great singers of the feeling movement, Elena Burke and Freddy Garcia Valdez, plus the participation of El Puente poets declaiming their poetry with musical descargas as an accompaniment. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, these sensual queer scenarios of Cuba's nightlife frequented by the Puentistas were deemed as decadent and anti-revolutionary, as the case against the documentary PM demonstrated. Isabel talked about it in her presentation. 4 years later, it was the visit in 1965 of a North American poet advocate of unrepentant queerness and of sexual liberation, Allen Ginsberg, whose outrageous behavior and public declarations of his sexual desires for Fidel Castro during his one-month stay as a juror for the Casa Las Americas poetry contest, it was him that brought policing attention and measures against two Puente poets that started to frequent him at the hotel, seeking his friendship and his collaboration, Jose Mario and Manuel Vallagas. Ironically, Jose Mario and Vallagas were also informing Ginsberg of the growing and concerted wave of repression and harassment against homosexuals in the Havana streets, and of the purges of students at the university and other state institutions to request his solidarity and perhaps his intervention. Unfortunately, Ginsberg's decision to use every public opportunity to advocate for free love and defend normative sexual rights had the contrary effect, and both Jose Mario and Vallagas were detained and Ginsberg ejected from the country. This raises the question of how much were the Puentistas already attuned and hungry for beatnik counterculture and notorious sexual permissiveness, or whether their approach to Ginsberg was more circumstantial and strategic, more defined by queer affinity and solidarity rather than direct or literary or programmatic influence of their beatnik years. So, do I have time to actually quickly summarize my point number 5? I'll do that now. Okay, finally, Alfonso raises the question of race and of how much the fact that a statistical majority of Puente writers were Afro-Cuban, and how much that had to do with the closing of the enterprise, of the editorial line. Did state Afrophobia, el miedo al negro, play as much of a role as state homophobia in the demise of the Puente enterprise? Again, Alfonso proceeds with due rigor by observing that against what some scholars claim, as she mentioned Linda Howe, against their attribution of Panther-inspired Black power separatist nationalism among its members, such as Pedro Pérez Arduy, against that thesis, the actual published work of our Cuban Puentistas from Santana to Pérez Arduy himself actually subscribes the revolution commitment to eradicate legal and socioeconomic discrimination against Blacks as citizens, while remaining critical, following the positions of Walterio Carbonell, of the state's attempt of de-Africanizing many aspects of Cuban national culture by reducing the prevalence of African belief systems and dismissing them as, or reducing them to folklore and musical spectacle. Right? So they are critical of that de-Africanization, but at the same time they're subscribing the emancipation of Blacks as full citizen in the revolutionary system. Still, Alfonso resorts to Ana María Simons' retrospective analysis of the Puentista strategy as a form of prophetic intersectionality, in which race plays a vital part, just as incipient feminism and as gay militancy. I quote from the interview, and I think it's such a great quotation that I will repeat it. Race, sexual identity, gender, social class, and independence are the 5 inseparable factors that led to the persecution and ultimately the destruction of El Puente. Blacks, gays, women, and modest people, we joined in an egalitarian an independent project. We spoke without complexes, as if we had the right to do so. That was El Puente's transgression. That was El Puente's transgression. How did this poetic alliance between different peripheral sectors actually come about? To what extent does it embody or even predict in the cultural sphere what Kimberly Crenshaw's ideals of intersectionality project or assume in the legal sphere? Could we map, no, in the urban situation of marginal barrios, of bars, of locations? How could we map the locations of the different members and the way and the vectors through which they converge? These are great lessons that should encourage us to keep on studying El Puente as a social and creative laboratory of entrepreneurial intersectionality in the culture sphere, one that actually fell victim to its own success, no? Because it was the success of this intersectionality that actually sort of made it the target of the repression of an intolerant white male state at that time. And as an example to revisit, to restore, and also to emulate. That's my critical reading.
Thank you so much, César. I know I was choosing the right person for my discussant. You have brought up so many important topics that are that inspire me to write, honestly, another book about El Puente. There's a lot that I didn't mention in the presentation and that I didn't include in the book because, as it happens with works of recuperation of memory or historical reconstruction, sometimes you have to choose what to include or what to leave behind outside. There is so much to bring back, and I wanted to prioritize giving space to those voices. So there is a lot of ramifications that I see now. Some of them I addressed in the book. Some of them I even addressed in the dissertation itself at the beginning, and didn't include later on in the book because I had to choose. So one important theme that you are bringing is the question of canonicity, because obviously El Puente writers differed greatly from its predecessors. They were not orígenes, they were not looking for teleological meaning to their poetry. They were not dealing with the same sense of even competition or rivalry that there was among the writers at the time. So, there I see two big things here. And in the one hand, they are iconoclastic impulse to differ from what was within the cultural field of the time. Not expressing a desire to be recognized or to be canonized, and that one can argue that was in a way contributed to, as you suggest, I think, to the fact that they were not part of the canon later on. That is true. The fact that they, for example, signed their books with lowercase in the first name and last name were lowercase, and Reinaldo Felipe, for example, is Reinaldo Garcia Ramos. He didn't use his last name, so you can imagine who would do that, no? Someone who doesn't really have any pretensions to transcend in the history of a canon. Or that is true, but at the same time, there was a consistent effort to put together their work in a publishing house, in an editor, in El Puente. That requires a lot of work and a lot of consistency. And I think that the hand of Ana María Simo there was like, it was visible that there was someone who was with a strict sense of editorial and work, binding all those efforts together. So in a sense, yes, I think they contributed themselves to that, but at the same time, I wouldn't claim that that was the main reason for the exclusion, because they were dealing with their rivals. They were dealing with the Caimanes, who really wanted to occupy that space. So I would say that it was a bad combination, no? Of, not a bad, but just a combination of two things. Their own sense of self-annulment in a way, and the competition within the cultural field. That's one thing. The other thing is the topic of the canon from canonicity from the present. Is it valid to talk about the canon, or to bring someone back into the canon of a literary history? There has been a lot of studies and a scholarly approach to the topic, and I choose to follow the notion of explained by John Guillory, in the sense of the canon not as a reconstruction of a list that is going to keep excluding others, but not so much as that list, but as a negotiation of cultural capital, and the distribution of that cultural capital, as he says. He puts the focus on that, and I think for me, because I have been debating with this idea of, well, the Puente, they themselves didn't choose to be canonical, so who am I to bring them back into the canon? But what I'm trying to do is, instead of creating that canonical list, rigid and unflexible list, the idea is to put the focus not so much on that list, but on the mentioning and the inclusion of these underrepresented writers, not so much from pluralistic perspective, although it is also valid, but the focus is not so much on that, but in the practicality of this approach, because by bringing them back, we can negotiate a space of cultural capital and distribution of that cultural capital that in Guillory's, well, he talks about the school, the institution, the academia, as a way, for him it's not so much important the canon, but the distribution of the canon in the academia, the way in which those new texts, incorporated texts penetrate the school, the system. In Cuba, we're far away from that, right? But I think it would be useful to negotiate a cultural capital for El Canon, for El Puente's writers, in the sense that it helps us deal with issues that continue to happen, to repeat, in Cuba, that deal with limits to creation, the limits of the artistic freedom of we have been seeing lately, right? It helps us situate ourselves in kind of a self-analysis of what is happening, what has happened after all these years in Cuba. Are artists freer now? Can they deal with questions of autonomy? For example, the question of autonomy is essential in El Puente, because they were one of the things, the causes for their shutdown or the disappearance was that they were autonomous. And autonomy keeps being a topic in today's Cuban literary and artistic field. Just think about Decree 349 that limits and I'm making a big jump here, but what I'm trying to say is that there is a repetition of things here that could be healthy to address from that point of view of making a line between all those itineraries of limitations to creation, limitations based on autonomy, capacity of association, many other things that keep repeating, and that all the controversy about the artistic freedom that we are seeing in Cuba today. So that's what I wanted to say about the canon. Maybe we can take some comments or questions from the. I saw a question from.
There's a question from Secola Tyler. She says, thank you, Dr. Alfonso and Dr. Salgado. To Dr. Alfonso, were you able to find whether the Harlem Renaissance served as a foundation to El Puente? There are so many intersections between both movements, and they were social-political movements for the US and Cuba.
That's such an interesting question. I didn't see any interconnection with the Harlem Renaissance. I in the interviews that the associations that were brought about were more with the Black Panthers. Not so much with the Black Renaissance. I think I remember reading an interview of one of them making reference to Langston Hughes, but not. I didn't see it in their prologues or in their poetry, but there's definitely connections there that would be interesting to explore. As I said, I was more interested in focusing on the alleged relationship or influence of the Black Power movement in El Puente, and I visited the Sommer Center to look for traces of, in the papers of some of the Black Panthers that were in Cuba. And I didn't see any references to the Black Renaissance. The question more for me was to determine if there was any connection with the Panthers.
Isabel, may I add there? One of the things that is remarkable to consider, right, is the fact that we know that there was an important intersection between the Harlem Renaissance and the and Cuban literature by the relationship and the friendship between Nicolas Guillen and Langston Hughes, right, and the fact that there was a type of affinity in terms of their poetic projects, being able to encapsulate, channel, the Black voice of the United States through the blues, and of the Afro-Cuban voice through the song in the case of Guillen. And what I find remarkable in the poetry of the Puente Black members is that they are sort of resisting a little bit that I think because they really want to do something different that will not automatically sort of say that they're following in Guillen's steps. What Nancy Morejon is doing is not at that point that much infused by Guillen's work. What Regina Herrera is writing, it's also something that actually really is going to a different sort of direction. And they, in a way, they remain skeptical in terms of how certain writers have become canonized. And I think that in that case, even Nicolas Guillen, who would be the obvious patriarch, right, of the group, you don't see, that those echoes, those resonances. And I think that is because they are sort of doing, and I think that you show this, they're engaged in their own type of cimarronaje, right? They want to remain minor, right? Because essentially they want to generate a different type of voice, and that's why they have reluctance towards canonical figures. And at that point, Nicolas Guillen was part of the canon, right? So again, I think that really they have a very subtle approach to canonicity, which makes us think about them as first in terms as a group as a youth group, and the sort of issues that they're sort of debating and presenting in their poetry, and their reluctance to engage in canon politics as something that actually gives them a lot of space, because if they actually jump into the conflicts of canonicity, they would feel constrained. They would lose their freedom.
Yes, and even though Guillen was one of the writers that helped them with paper, so they had a good relationship, but they didn't want to give the impression, I guess, that they were being influenced by a specific tendency, or even with Orígenes, the group of poets that they refer to in their prologues. Even though Gerardo Fulleda said later in the interview to me that was not true, that some of them had influence of Orígenes, but they didn't want to give the impression of that. So there was a resistance, and that's probably why, not because of lack of interest, but because they wanted to separate themselves from the norm. Mm-hmm. Precisely, I think I'm saying your name. I think you're my student. What inspired me to look into this topic and write a book about it? It's I always write about the forgotten. that's my choice, my path, my passion. So I think because they had been obliterated from the Cuban literary history, I thought that it was, and for reasons that were not justified, I thought that it was a good project to engage. I have a question from Gretchen. Hi, Gretchen. As a psychologist, I'm also interested in the post-suppression years of the main figures of El Puente. Did they find ways to express their creative ideas and to maintain those personal connections despite the suppression? That has to do with the erasure, right? The topic of erasure that you made reference to. And I'm going to try to answer Gretchen's question and your comment. Well, something that that happened after the end of the Ediciones, some people remained in Cuba, became canonical, like Nancy Morejon, Miguel Barnett, and others left to Spain. Jose Mario, after leaving the UMAPs, he left for Spain. Others came to the United States. Ana María Simo, who had a traumatic experience because of the electroshock treatment that she underwent, came to the US, and that story or that history is not healed yet. They haven't been able to reconnect all of them. Maybe some to a certain extent. I know that some of them have been back to Cuba, but there is a lot of conflict and there is a lot of pain that they haven't been able to overcome completely. So that is why this topic is so difficult too, because some of these authors I have been chasing for years. They didn't want to talk about El Puente. Mm-hmm. They wanted to forget. And that's why it took me also years to publish the book, because I have been collecting all these pieces like in a very minutious way. But and that's why a pending project would be to bring together. No, I'm not going to say much, but we're brewing some ideas that may help that, right? May help that happen. So many of them, I would say most of them, remain writing. I think that was the best way to deal with pain. As I said, some were awarded prizes in Cuba, others in the US did remain more like in the shadows, but they kept writing. Some of them kept communicating, some of them went back to Cuba. And making a connection with the topic of erasure, that is structural erasure that you mentioned, César. One way in which I tried to overcome and to tap into those silences, and in which I tried to respect as much as I could, was through the interview, right? The interview as a process of accessing and probing the memory, which sometimes, I remember when I interviewed Rogelio Garcia Fure, he mentioned, Rogelio Rodríguez Fure, right? He mentioned that many people have asked questions about his work with Afro-Cuban folklore, but no one had asked anything about El Puente. So he had to start, and it was a beautiful interview because he sang to me songs of Afro-Cuban culture. He performed for me. It was really beautiful. And it was interesting to see that no one had asked him about El Puente. So the idea of oral history also brings that, connects with that idea of the canon, not as a fixed structure, but as the confluence of flexible and fluid status of memories and of past, of histories that are kind of overlapping and conforming this rhizomatic canon, instead of thinking of a canon as a root, as a fixed list, where by composing this new approach to canonicity, we're also suggesting how to look into literary history, no, and how to recover, and at the same time honoring their iconoclastic choices and their anti-canonical stance. And in that sense, I also took into account the notions of memory as a rhizomatic project, no, as a reconstruction that it's not looking to recover a monumental past, but bits and pieces of those past from each one, and by allowing to multiple entry points into that past, right? And it's complex because everyone remembers things in a different way, but that's also part of the reconstruction. And also that idea of looking into the past, not as a militant of the memory, as Elizabeth Yellin says, but as an entrepreneur of memory, someone who's looking into the past, not to dwell in the past, but to look into the future, to see how we can connect, again, canonicity as the regain of cultural capital. How can we take advantage of this reconstruction, right? I think that's a wonderful question, Gretchen. Thank you so much. There is another question in regards to the question of autonomy. While the members of El Puente play a marginalized role within the cultural politics of Cuba, they seem to play into global aesthetic tendencies of the literary market in their search for expressive freedom. I'm thinking of the Mundo Nuevo, Casa de las Americas debate that followed, but also this countercultural youth aesthetics of the 60s. In addition, the intersectional reasons that caused their discontinuation. Do you see the obliteration from Cuban literary history as an attempt of the state to control market forces? It's interesting because at that time, there were these debates on Revista Casa de las Americas about committed literature. And it always caught my attention that writers like Cortázar and Rob Grillet participated in this interview, this survey about committed literature, and they freely said that they had a very flexible notion of commitment. And here I'm connecting with the point of existentialism, no, that César made. And they were allowed to say that freely and to be published. So I think an important thing to mention here is the topic of, I don't know what word to use in English. In Cuba would be padrinaje, no? The power broker, to have a power broker that legitimates your work. In the case of El Puente, they didn't have that power broker. Like for example, the filmmakers had. The filmmakers had an Alfredo Guevara. The filmmakers, by the way, were during the golden age of the Cuban cinema, were creating the most experimental works of art. And they were being attacked by another sector, the Stalinists. And Guevara, who had attacked Lunes de Revolución, had converted into this flexible and experimental. Well, I don't think he converted, he was, but for reasons that we don't know, he was one of the attackers of the experimentalism of Lunes de Revolución. So I don't know if the question of market forces, it's at stake here. I think there are other issues here that are controlling the conversation, which are the question of cultural capital and legitimacy of that capital and the space that these forces are occupying in the field. But again, when we mention, when César mentioned existentialism as something that was used as a tool against them, it calls attention because it is curious, because for Sartre and for Camus, they had engaged in a much more flexible take on how existentialism was also a change of a political tool, right? So the notion of engagement, for example, existentialism, but engagement, the commitment in literature I think Del Puente understood very well that, and because that's what they professed. They were, they knew that their existence came before the revolution, and they look at the revolution through that lens, right? But they didn't have the cultural capital to transcend with that message. And I think that's maybe what was at fault aquí, César?
Something that I would add to, I think your answer is fabulous. Something that I would actually sort of look at in terms of the fact of, I agree that from what I know and what I've learned from you concerning El Puentes, the Puentes did not have a power broker, not just inside Cuba, but actually sort of allowing them to have access to the global book market, the way, for example, of the boom writers had, in terms of having an agent that could actually sort of get them contracts so that they could publish in Barcelona and also in Mexico. The Puentistas were just too poor to aspire to that level of access to the global book market. But one thing that they did, what we're attuned to, is not in their poetry, but it's in their in their forms of the sociability, is that they were aware of the countercultural movement, right? And I recently, as you know, I got to read the recently published memoirs, right? The diary, it's a diary that Ginsberg kept while he was outraging everybody in Cuba. And they have the idea of the countercultural movement, of the youth movement, of young people being able to transform the world, of inviting the Beatles. There's a moment in which he's speaking to Aide Santa Maria, and he's sort of trying to convince her, if you bring the Beatles to Cuba, the embargo is going to be lifted, right? And the kids are going to be fascinated with Cuba. The fact that you're welcoming the Beatles is going to create this ripples of a spirituality. I mean, it was Ginsberg that was speaking. So I wonder to what extent, this was just one of the questions that I raised at the end, to what extent, the Puente people were considering, the Ginsberg as an ambassador of a particular global aesthetic of meditative transcendence, revolutionary sexuality for sure, and to what extent they really weren't sort of playing they weren't sort of playing they were not into his playbook, right? I think it's a very complex question to us, because in the end, it wasn't El Puente who invited Ginsberg, it was Casa de las Americas, right? And they approached Ginsberg in order to translate his work. And so I don't think that they were ready for the sort of the type of strategy that Ginsberg brought to Cuba, in which he was openly expressing his sexual desires for the most visible revolutionaries in the country, right? So how much do you think these people really would have considered Ginsberg their new Sartre or their new Camus?
Well, they certainly didn't have the time to verify that, because Ginsberg was kicked out of Cuba like next day. But I have been thinking about that, and even though El Puente writers didn't have a direct influence of Ginsberg and the Beatnik generation in their poems or their writing, there was maybe an association in terms of they were both rebelling against something, the patriarchal order, or the case of the Beatnik generation against the capitalism and the mass culture. That is what brings counterculture, the sense of rebellion and experimentation with drugs and Eastern religions as a topic in there. So we don't see that in El Puente's poetry. As you said, they were not ready for that. They were more like into more traditional paths. But at the same time, I think there is an interesting association, because in a way they were also part of a counterculture in which they were countering the idea of the revolution as a slogan, as a fixed topic, and they were negotiating a space for much more flexible and counter versus that notion of closeness of petrified revolution. They were also countering something, not the same that the Beatniks were rejecting, but there was that sense of rebelliousness that maybe they saw as an inspiring force in Ginsberg, but they didn't have time to get there.
No, they clearly approached him to have him be an accomplice, but they didn't know what sort of accomplice he was going to be.
Yeah, and unfortunately the result was awful, because after, well, as I mentioned, Mario was sent to the MAP, and he was criminalized by seeming homosexual, not by being, by appearing homosexual, because there was no way to prove that, but that was the accusation. Mm-hmm. As in his own words. So yeah, it was unfortunate. Is there any other questions? This is the Q&A. Let me check the chat really quick. We have Jasmine. Jasmine is making reference to the Telegram. We haven't seen a Telegram for years, right? I don't see any more questions. Maybe do you want to double check, César?
I'm just seeing that Jennifer Argueta is saying that she is concerning the forgotten. She wants to recuperate or research the work of Roque Dalton. And again, I'm just, it just brought to mind the fact that I worked recently with Jorge Dalton, his son, who actually is him and his brother are keeping Roque Dalton's papers. And the thing is that Roque Dalton is also a figure that is connected to Cuba very closely, and especially in the 60s and in the early 70s. So that will be a very interesting recuperation as well, sort of bringing back the figure of Roque, which I think is really fascinating in the context of not just in terms of his relationship to his admiration for Che Guevara, but also his friendship with people like Julio Cortázar. And it was a friendship that was developed in Cuba. So that's another project.
Yeah, Jennifer was my student. She's completing a PhD now in Spanish, and you were writing that thesis with me. So I'm very proud of you that you followed that topic, and get in contact with Professor Salgado to find out about those papers. That's what I would say. Yeah. Jessica Villalta, thank you so much for your comment, and maybe we can refer at the end to close as a way of closing to that idea of intersectionality.
Sure.
I just wanted to say that there's like two main things here: intersectionality as a methodological approach from the present to El Puente, and but also intersectionality as an ontology, you know, as the fact that they were all this diverse group. And I have to say that, and you mentioned this, César, and also historian Mario Castillo mentioned it, that something to explore is in this intersectionality approach is the topic of class. What is the meaning of class in this discussion, in this reconstruction of El Puente, the concept of barrio, the associabilities among them, the type of network that it was established because they had a common barrio, a common class, a common upbringing maybe. Many of them were Black. Georgina was cleaning houses. Manolo Granados was parking cars in the Central Park. Living a very super marginal, I don't want to say the word marginal, peripheral, certainly not in the center, right? So that is something that I would like to explore more with the help of my colleagues, and how to really take advantage of this intersectionality, that it's there, and that is also a tool that we can use to better comprehend all these connections of categories, right? I don't know if you want to add anything in that sense, César.
I think that there's so many things in terms of the sort of sociability that they manage, the fact that they had rituals, and that when we speak about the Orígenes group, we speak about their ceremonia. They had a sort of a liturgical calendar that they met. But the Puentistas had their strategies for congregation, for debate, for reading each other. They were a group. I mean, when people say that basically it was only an editorial enterprise, I think that you've proven, especially with the reconstruction, both of the immaterial archive, the memories, but also in terms of what you've been able to rescue in terms of the textual evidence. You know, where did they have these teas? No, from what was the address in the envelope, right? How do we actually see how the context of the revolution allow for these sectors to recognize each other and to support each other as they did? I mean, it's you know, gays, blacks, and women. And their understanding that they would sort of remain on this side of the fight for the canon, because the thing about the canon is it was made by white heteronormative males, right? So I think that part of the reluctant canonicity has to do with the fact that they are sort of trying to engage a different sort of a counter sociability against it's counter hegemonic against you know, the people who have made the nation with a capital N, etc., which usually are straight white male, right? And that's why they sort of sought to come together and generate a counter poetics, which is what you so well document in your book, and not with a whole sort of a cadres, a whole sort of it's almost a society of Puente scholars, right? Because everybody has to go do the interview. You know, somebody finds this piece and shares it with the other, but the methods are really congruent. You work. It seems that you're working as a team. So I think that's really, and it's because that's required by the nature, what we're calling the intersectional nature of this group.
Thank you so much, César, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'm honored to be able to share this space with you, and César, having you and Doris as part of the conversation. It has been really a pleasure and an honor. So the nicest thing about this is to be able to socialize this knowledge, and it makes me happy to be able to talk about El Puente with you. And it also makes me happy that we have plans to continue working, recovering this memory, because it is not done. I mean, there's a lot of work to do. And to seeing you from Orígenes to El Puente is also, it's hallucinating.
It's an adventure. No, I'm learning so much, and I have so much to continue sort of probing, right? Thanks to you, Isabel. So thank you as well.
Well, you're an inspiration too. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.